Are you too sometimes stressed out by financial and social pressure, by comparing yourself to mere images of people you see on the World Wide Web? Don't you too sometimes feel like you're spending too much time in front of screens and technical devices, because there's an emptiness inside you that only mass consumption can fill? Doesn't the existential fear combined with the feeling of powerlessness overwhelm you at times? Well then, join Spawful Boys and head on over to 2121. In 2121, we can experience a world after the climate liberation, a world that has left behind the burden of captivating algorithms and has returned to divine chaos, a world where the only opinion you're concerned with is your tribes and families, a world where the fight against your own insignificance is replaced by the fight for your own and your kin's life. In 2121, you can enjoy the warm mid-December breeze rustling through ruins of the old high-rises, those monuments of a societal god complex. Take your loved ones for a ride in your scrap metal automobile, maybe to Portland's precious Palm Beaches or the dusty deserts of Delaware. At nighttime, you may sit by the campfire and share legends about the North, where constant rainfalls have turned the remaining peoples into fish hybrids, or about the ever-burning South, where most tribes sent their outcasts to live amongst the flames. Maybe a glass of wine. Maybe fire up the good old electric generator to play songs of the old people on the gramophone. Songs that sing of better days, of hope. 2121, a dream that need not be dreamed, a future that feels nostalgic.
Even though there has been scientific proof on the topic of climate change for decades, and even though larger parts of the global industry recognize the existence of anthropogenic climate change, and even though most sovereign nations have come together and have, at least to some degree, committed to combat climate change, little more than a lot of talking has come about. A lot of talking about the reality of what is to come, about the necessity to act, about the path of least resistance. However, going on like before obviously doesn't cut it, and by now, a light version of 2121, this fever dream of an opener, is very much likely to happen, even if our industry and transport cease to exist tomorrow. Not only are we late to the party, we can even find our way into the club. And our action, or rather inaction, is responsible for that. For besides decades of self-anesthesia, there's no real sign of even a change, let alone abandonment of our ways. So let's explore what exactly is this benzo that helps us forget that reality, and who exactly keeps prescribing it. Okay, before we dive deep, let me emit a little what's what and who's who of climate change, just to set an atmosphere. As you may know, the main reason for the change in climate is a rapid increase in the greenhouse gas concentration on the surface of our planet, mostly carbon dioxide. That is unprecedented and leads to the greenhouse effect, trapping the incoming heat from the sun and thus gradually hotboxing humanity. Since the late 19th century, when we first started emitting greenhouse gases on a larger scale, Earth has heated up on average 1.2 degrees. Americans, cover your ears, Celsius. Weather extremes like floods, droughts and especially heat waves have become more frequent, the ocean's water is heating up, ice sheets are melting and numerous animal species are making a French exit over changed conditions in their ecosystems. The process of global warming also functions as a feedback loop that becomes apparent in a reduced surface area covered in sunlight reflecting ice, an ever increasing amount of algae on our ocean's surface additionally absorbing heat from the sun, and an ever decreasing number of plants recycling CO2 through photosynthesis. But how is the responsibility for that massive fuck up shared among all humans? Well, going by sector, roughly 75% of all anthropogenic GHG emissions are caused purely by energy use, mostly by the global industry. Domestic housing, including heating and electricity, is responsible for 10% of all emissions. Some 12% is road transport, 2% aviation, and a part of the emissions caused by energy use also factor into the 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions that our global food system accounts for. Industry, however, does not only live off of energy, but relies heavily on the exploitation of natural resources other than fossil fuels, like animals and plants, which are vital to stabilizing the Earth's climate. Going by nation state, the United States and Canada are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas by population, followed by South Korea, Russia, Japan, China, and most countries of Western Europe. Just a side note, a lot of production and energy consumption of these countries takes place in regions of the global south and thus is not necessarily factored into these calculations. Also, legitimacy to put the blame on nation states is limited in a global capitalist system where the nation state's significance decreases rapidly. Speaking of which, going by class, over half of the emissions are caused by the top 10% richest people on the planet, and 15% are caused by only the top 1%, also accounting for the most growth in GHG emitted. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% share 7% of all emissions. But, spoiler alert, are oftentimes the most vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. So, having laid the groundwork, if you really want to get a grip on just how absolutely trashed we are, you need to understand the system that obviously doesn't work anymore and the solution that we are trying so hard not to see. You need to know the basics of these two concepts. Our presently dominating economic system, namely neoliberalism, and climate justice theory, concerned with the distribution of responsibility and sacrifice in regards to causes and consequences of climate change. Luckily, I'm somewhat of an expert on money making and fairness myself, but, you know, in theory. So let's gloss over what those two mean. Neoliberalism on the one hand is a way of economic policy making in which the free market and free trade act as the main drivers of regional and global class dynamics and wealth accumulation. The ideal world from that perspective would exclude any price control and allow government interference only to serve the generally privatized industries. It is by all means a form of free market capitalism which holds economic growth as a consequence of market-oriented innovation and competition as the highest principle. Growth, by means of innovation, sits at the heart of this ideology, as no neoliberal or even capitalist system can survive without growing. As a consequence, businesses are being endlessly upsized, assets are being endlessly diversified, and the invaluable is endlessly being commodified. Climate justice theory, on the other hand, describes a growing body of literature discussing roadmaps to distribute responsibility in mitigating and adapting to climate change. This includes responsibility for present and future generations to mitigate, a responsibility to help prepare and protect those most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and the historic responsibility of early industrializers like Western Europe and the US. Basically, what that means is, the ones most to blame for and least affected by climate change have the responsibility to reduce the harm and protect those who are not or less responsible for GHG emissions, but suffer most from the effects of climate change. It just so happens by some freak of nature that the countries most responsible are the ones with the most means to subvert and adapt to climate change. So in practice, that would mean that industrialized nations should become carbon neutral immediately and help transfer technology to achieve that too, and build protective measures in countries that can afford neither the transformation nor the adaptation. Because only if we all win, we don't lose. To summarize, we have the reality of climate change and the current global political and economic system and its values on one side, and a pretty clearly outlined and accessible understanding of the moral solution to overcome this challenge on the other. Preempting a classic Coca-Cola Mentos situation. Observe. You know what? Let's get a little dramatic here. The current dominating economic paradigm can so far be accredited for a lot of profit and a lot more waste. The lion's share of the profit, however, has been sacked by transnational financial elites, while the waste is mostly concentrated in areas where people have little to no influence, not by financial nor any other means. Global neoliberalism has expanded capitalist class structures to the transnational, and the oversupply of cheap plastic products, combined with the doctrine of individual consumption as a form of self-expression, adds into this exemplary waste sorting. While value chain organization almost exclusively factors in financial results, humanitarian and environmental effects are widely disregarded, and so the scramble between transnational elites over the world's resources like food, plants, oil, minerals, and last but not least, the consumer, continues amidst an incoming climate crisis. Global capital contributes to this crisis in almost every aspect, promoting overconsumption to legitimize overproduction, extending transport routes, and, for instance, sizing up farmland to make the global food system the single most emission-strong industry of them all. Stressing the importance of global trade in this regard, over half of the food-related carbon footprint of countries like, let's say, the UK, is produced abroad. In particular, the beef industry is the main purchaser of soy that has already destroyed large parts of the Brazilian Amazon and Cerrado area is worth a quick shout-out here. Add a tablespoon of destruction of diverse ecosystems through monocultures, leaving behind damaged soil that makes classic reforestation an unimaginable challenge, and you get a pretty decent catastrophe cocktail. Jumping over the soon-to-be Atlantic jacuzzi, Western petro-ultras like Shell, ExxonMobil and Chevron have turned the most important West African ecosystem into hell on earth, as the Niger Delta, one of the most polluted regions in the world, is subject to flaring, acid rains, environmental degradation and overall exploitation of wildlife and society. Plus, you know, they produce oil. Let's island hop eastwards once more to where most of your shitty ripped jeans and dumb-looking Balenciaga sock bootlegs are produced. To where the engine that drives fast fashion of green sustainable businesses like H&M, Zara, Primark, Adidas, Nike and all of that shit produces more waste and GHG than all of global aviation and maritime shipping together. To where people have to suffer through the most inhumane working conditions just to get some pollution-flavored food on the table. All of this because of the industry relying on you to buy a cheap shirt or hoodie or sneakers every month to sustain growth. Wrapping up, The international financial industry, set to become of major importance for the development in climate change mitigation, makes fast, urgent and long-term investment and thus broad and stable development in technology like photovoltaics increasingly probable. Now all of this goes to show how our production-dependent global free market capitalism with Western multinationals as a main driver keeps f***ing it up for all of us, and late or under-industrialized nations have to pull back from the same wasteful industrialization, thus the Western development model they've been forced to apply, while having to cope with the regional and global realities of climate change. Some f***ing nerds calculated that the world would have to come up with about $73 trillion for a full transition to net zero emissions. With most of the under-industrialized countries making less guap than Amazon Basics Voldemort, this number should taste a little sour. But wait. Only observing the system from that side might have our minds a little clouded, don't you think? I mean, maybe there's some chance in capital to fight this thing and even make a buck or two on top of it. Looking at policies like the European emissions trading, for instance, shows that if you give corporations a profit incentive by making them pay for emitting GHG, a significant amount of CO2 can be saved. Well, except it doesn't. Taking it a step further, not only using the legitimate market power to their advantage, global players are also constantly facing lawsuits regarding greenwashing, the practice of marketing your product as sustainable or green when it's absolutely not. Generally, those lawsuits get settled and almost never are there any major long-term repercussions for their business. Just take a look at Volkswagen driving home record sales year after one of the biggest cases of consumer fraud in the history of the automobile industry, regarding the engine efficiency. Or your favorite petro giants making case after case while remaining in and substantiating their cartel position, because even after losing all that settlement money, it still pays to be a f***ing prick. Listen, I'm not saying that there's no ethical business at all, just that with our current level of consumption and overall structural issues, there's no way the damage can be compensated by some rainbow-ass ice cream manufacturer. All those examples are just a tiny peak of the top of the upper part of a fraction of the whole motherfucking iceberg. But they are examples of the biggest sinners in all things climate, and thus show exactly how, if there's no change in our consumption, no investment in long-term strategies rather than short-term profit, a huge chunk of emissions will prevail, just like the degradation of our ecosystems through pollution and exploitation of resources. And no matter how much fashion brands promote sustainability, and how much food brands claim green farming, or how much the oil industry gives back to communities or commits to future transformation, they all need us to keep buying, not less, not at the same rate, no, more. No business can survive selling less than a day before. Every move is a business move. Every green project is a recuperation, a co-option of the fight against climate change. The mere aesthetic or mask of sustainability without the substance of it. And every one of these co-options are just means for survival in the market. Or, to use a more grindset type vocab, innovation. Oh, and I'm mentioning it just for reasons of completeness. When it comes to technology transfers and aid and protective measures from industrialized to under-industrialized nations, well, exactly. By now it should have become apparent that climate justice and our economic order, or rather disorder, are not in the slightest compatible. This disorder relies on growth relies on continuing overproduction, and this overproduction, in turn relying on global exploitation of land, resources and people, is responsible for climate change. Responsible in so many more ways than you driving your car to work every day, because alternative modes of transportation are deliberately being suppressed. Continuing on this path, green technology and practice are becoming just another marketing move, the source of capital accumulation, a new competitor in the market, here to milk the cow dry before we all eat dirt. Continuing on this path, the poor of this world will carry the whole weight of whatever is to come, while the privileged and responsible will make the land spared from destruction their own Garden of Eden. Or f*** off to another planet altogether. If you are even in the slightest interested in changing the world for the better, you will probably have at some point researched how to live a more sustainable life, and that's great. I would never go so far as to say that personal choices, however insignificant they might seem, don't matter. However, one has to become wary of industries and media outlets trying to rub off the responsibilities onto the consumer, while doing everything to subvert alternative modes of consumption. Not only does that feel like a punch in the face, but while making money off of seemingly more sustainable products that you're supposed to buy if you're a good human, they evoke a feeling of comfort and satisfaction in us, a feeling that we're doing all we can, or at least all that's necessary, which we are definitely not. As long as economic growth exists as the main objective, as long as consumption, however sustainable it might be marketed, is part of the solution, we're always gonna have a problem. Free market capitalism got us into this mess, and it sure as shit won't get us out. And if we keep trusting its promises and run after its supposed values of fake liberty and fair competition, we're buying ourselves a one-way ticket to 2121.
It's a sin, my darling, how how I love you, because I know our love can never be. It's a sin to keep this memory of you when silence proves that you've forgotten me.